Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Becoming a Birder, Part 2, The Mighty Ducks, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Kristina Disney. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Take it away, Kristina.
Thank you so much, Rob. And hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining in for part two. And before we launch into the delightful world of ducks, I want to give a shout out to Nancy, who wrote in from our first episode, our first webinar on becoming a birder. And so I kind of want to answer Nancy's question or to the prompt that she left me in her note. Thank you so much, Nancy, for giving a shout. I appreciate the comments. So for anyone who tuned in for Becoming a Birder Part 1, we were talking about how hummingbirds are the only true birds that hover. And Nancy, who's a lover of birds, wrote in, she's like, well, actually, that's not the only one that hovers. The pied kingfisher hovers. And so I went in and I did a little bit of digging so I could find out where it is the sort of line is why is it people were saying that only hummingbirds hover. And so this is what we found out is that hummingbirds are the only ones that truly hover. And what I mean by that is that to hover, it takes so much energy and it takes a certain body shape and size. And so there are other birds. I think we talked about maybe kestrels last time, and the kingfisher is now the one we're talking about this time, that's capable of hovering. But these birds, because of their size and the orientation of their wings, they're actually only able to hover in a headwind. So that's the definitive line between a true hovering bird, like our hummingbirds, and everyone else. Usually those birds of prey who are kind of taking a pause before they do that lunge in, like our kingfisher here, and grabs its snack along the way. But it's still pretty amazing to think about that, right? To be able to hold yourself midair, pause, and then dive. Pretty special, pretty spectacular. So thank you, Nancy. I was happy I got to learn a little bit more and dig into that one before we kept going. And without further ado, let's roll into the Mighty Ducks. All right, so not only is it a great show from my childhood, but there are ducks in and around our world everywhere, all the time. We grow up with most of them. I would say that, we see them in pop culture, and we don't really think about it very much about how much they're intrinsically tied into a lot of our stories, the ugly duckling, right? Things like that. Even when I was looking up some pictures for what we're about to go through today, what did Google have on its little image board? Because the Olympics were on, it had some synchronized swimming ducks. So ducks are definitely on the mind. Ducks are out in the world. But when we're rolling, when we think about what really is a duck, well, I'm a big fan of etymology. I like thinking about words and how we got to them. So duck, the English word that we get from, breaks down from the word Old English, which was duque, which was, or deuce, well, see, I don't know how to pronounce the U with the bar. But it means to dive, right? So it's playing off of that notion that it is, or the notion to bend down. So you're right, when someone yells duck at you, it is both the quack duck and the motion of moving down. The root word is the same, which makes sense as soon as you think about it, but sometimes with words we forget that they're always connected. If we go in a more sciencey way of thinking about what is a duck, well, it is a bird that belongs to the Antidae family. So that includes ducks, geese, swans, it's all looped in there. And in general, we find them all around our world, pretty much on every continent except for Antarctica, not including the ones that are in the water. Just talking about land for a quick second there. And they're adapted for a semi-aquatic life, right? They're eating anywhere from small insects to plants to crustaceans to fish, things like that. And there are a lot of them in the world. It's kind of an intimidating amount when you're starting off as a birder in this big wide world. There's 174 species that we can find in this family. But don't worry, this is the thing about birds. That's exactly it. Whenever you look at birds, you're like, oh my gosh, there are so many. How am I ever going to keep track of them? Well, in the same reason why when we started with our part one, it's not about learning all the things, learning them all at once. It's about slowing it down, breaking it up into some bite-sized pieces, and getting just some general groups and traits. Humans are amazing at pattern recognition. This is something I've said before, and I will probably say many, many times during these webinars. But I'm saying it to reaffirm the skill you already have, right? We love word searches. We love finding things. We love finding patterns in color, in shape. We're naturally doing it all the time. And all birding is you're consciously taking that skill pattern and you're honing it, right? I think um, some folks might know this from some previous webinars that I've done, but I do a lot of community science and we do community monitoring. And monitoring is just a fancy word for noticing. Birding is just a fancy sort of layered way of saying, I pay attention to birds. You don't have to have the fanciest binoculars or the coolest gear or the thickest field book. All that says is, hey, I'm someone who pays attention to birds. And how cool is that to be able to say that? So we're going to focus on North America. We're going to start with our awesome possum ducks because they're one of the most accessible species that we see so often that give us a good chuckle, usually with their behavior and their cheekiness. And so let's start with what's familiar. Let's start with what we know. So when we think about North American ducks, I'm going to break them down into even smaller groups. But really, if you can learn to identify the ducks on this page, you've pretty much got them. And it seems like a lot, there might be 30 some, not just shy of 40 on this page. But we're going to learn about patterns and traits, and we're going to start breaking them into smaller and smaller groups. But I want to start off with just one duck first. We're going to start off the one that we all know, whether we realize it or not, whether you've thought about calling it a mallard duck. It's the most ubiquitous duck in the whole world, the most populated, or the highest population. You can find it pretty much circumpolar, all across the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere as well. And these are the origin species of all of our domesticated ducks. So even if you're like, well, I've never really seen one in the wild, pretty much if you've seen any duck on any TV cartoon, all of them except for the Muscovy duck line, all were genetically coming from a mallard duck. So that's another kind of cool thing to think about. When we think about ducks, they're actually pretty long-lived creatures. So that friendly duck that you've seen in your pond maybe every day on your walk to work, it could very well be the same one that's had you've had your 25-year career, and that duck is also anywhere between 20 to 30 years old almost, right? So you can kind of have a relationship with these guys, get to know some of their personalities. Mating pairs will often come back to the same locations. And that generation time, right, that turnover is about every 2.5 years. And so they are very migratory as well. And so when you think about how it is that we all can have these relationships with ducks in different ways, it is because they're covering so much of our world. So when we're looking at the colors here, and I'll point this out sort of more focus on North America a little bit later on, but our sort of peachy pink color there is our breeding area. The purple is wintering, and then the blue is all year round. So you can kind of see where when it's summertime, they move up, eat all lots of yummy things, gets cold, they move back down. And believe it or not, today there are around 20 million mallard ducks in the world. Again, for anyone who tuned into part 1, compare that to the domesticated chicken, which has 30 billion in the world, right? So our most common duck is barely a fraction of our most domesticated chicken. And that includes our domesticated species too, right? So it's kind of an interesting one to think about when it comes to that. But they're super successful. That was kind of the reason why I wanted to bring that up, is that they fit into a lot of different environments. And we're going to talk about that as we sort of move through their life cycle here. So instead of starting chicken or egg, let's start duck egg or duck or egg. And let's think about what life is like to start off as a little duck out there in the world, right? So most ducks, they make their nests out of vegetation they can find around them. So they pick a spot. They're not like other birds, like songbirds, that will find something and fly and bring it there. They don't do that. What they do is they pick a spot that they like that's kind of decently camouflaged, maybe hidden a bit under some other vegetation, and then they start pulling all of the bits towards them. Ever watch a duck grab something with its bill and kind of yank on it a bit? They essentially fluff up their nest that way. They'll even grab some vegetation from above. They'll build the structure of their nest, and then what they'll do is they'll pull out some of their own feathers, and you can kind of see a few of them in this photo here and there, and then they'll use that to help insulate their nests. And this is something that I feel like we all get told as kids, and it's one of those ones where like, is it an urban myth or is it true, right? What happens if we touch bird eggs? Well, one of the biggest ones is that birds are extremely sensitive to that. And so as a kid, I remember being told, if I find a nest, don't touch it. That high level of curiosity. If you find chicks, don't touch them, which is such a hard thing to do, especially when you hear them crying or see them on their own. Um, but that's because the ducks, the adults will abandon them. The mothers will abandon them, right? So that's one. It's not just a story from my childhood. It is very much still true. So as cute and as darling as they are, even if you think that it's not going to make it, you're better off hands off, to let that life stage carry its course either way. So, but let's say those eggs come to hatch after about 20 to 30 days, depending on sort of our climate and incubation period. And then that leads us to, of course, the most cute, the most darling, the most fluffy ducklings. Um, and so the average mallard, when we're talking about a lovely lady like we see here, she can have anywhere from 9 to 13 eggs, which is quite a lot of little ducklings to take care of when you think about it, all to sort of keep them corralled. And when they hatch, they're born precocial. So what that means is they are ready to walk, they are fluffy, they are ready to self regulate their temperature, their eyes are open, they can see, and they are out of the nest and taking their swim by the time they are 16 hours old. If you're lucky, your adult child is functional at 16 years old, but even then might be a stretch. You still have that legal 18 you got to wait to push them out the door with, right? Sorry. No, I mean, we were all those children, right? At least a little bit. So we all don't mature as fast as our ducklings do. And they do mature so quickly, right? So they're born ready to walk, ready to rock and talk at 16 hours, and they are fully grown to an adult size in 2 months or about 8 weeks. And it's kind of cool to think about that progression, right? So by the time they're a week old, or even 2 weeks old, we're getting to that. They're half the size of what an adult would be. And then they slowly grow, they fill out, they call it fledge. So they give up those cute fluffy feathers that are keeping them warm, and they exchange them in for their flight feathers. And that's again why this is such a critical period, because they're flightless, right? So predation is a thing during that stage, right? When we're thinking about those 9 to 13 ducklings, we're thinking about survival rate. This is called something in biology we called R selection. So it means that the species is willing to have lots of young in anticipation that most of them won't survive, versus a K-selected species where they're investing in fewer number of offspring with the idea that they're putting more effort and therefore it's more likely to survive, right? So different strategies for different species. Now, they're going to reach into the adult size after only 2 months, but they're not going to reach, we'll say, adult behavior, or really what we usually sort of class that as, which is mating behavior or mating age, until about a year. Females are about ready to mate after a year or so. They're usually not quite as successful at rearing their young till a little while on, but same is also kind of true for the males. They're sexually mature around a year or so, and they get their full plumage up. This is kind of a fun picture. This is a picture of a male mallard performing his mating ritual. So what they do is they flap their wings to raise themselves up out of the water. You got him see him kind of perched there. Looks like he's holding his wingtips together in this really awesome photo. And then what they do is they shake their head. Sometimes they'll even look back over at the female, being like, hey, look at me. I look pretty good. And if the female agrees and thinks that they are looking pretty good in their mating display, then they'll pair up. And that mated pair is going to spend quite a bit of time together. The male won't help in rearing. After the breeding's done, he usually pieces out, so the female's left for that. But the solo couple doesn't always stay solo. So one of the things I would say that ducks are infamous for, it's one of the facts that if you think about ducks, you can't help but come to this if you already know it. If you know where I'm going with this, yep, we're going all the way there. We'll tell the full story. If not, hang on for the ride. So there is a lot of forced mating that happens in ducks. About 35% of pairings, even though there's a pair, sort of solo drakes, that's the word for the male ducks, will come and will hold down females. They'll usually grab them by the back of the neck and forcibly mate with them. And this is an example of a female just getting mobbed by several males. She was originally sort of swimming with her mated pair. And then another male duck swoops in, kind of attacks, and then creates this whole flurry, and all of these males are trying to mate with her. It's really, really intense. Um, and in human words, we have other words for it, but when we're talking about animals, we call it forced mating. But it is not a one-way street. So the sexual evolution of ducks is one of the weirdest, wildest, wackiest things as far as battle of the sexes goes, in my opinion, in the animal world. So there's a lot of forced mating that happens. In response to that, males and females, so males have developed longer and longer penises, and the female vagina has evolved in response. So the male actually has a clockwise corkscrew penis, and the female has a counterclockwise vagina. And they try to prevent the other male from mating. So, like I said, if we think about that female we were talking about before, she's chosen her mate. Um, and if another male tries to mate with her and she's not having of it, they can mate. Sure, go right ahead. He might be able to deposit sperm. But what she does is she actually contracts all of her muscles, which stop the sperm from going further than you see all of those different spirals. Basically, it stops it at an earlier stage. Uh, and so, one, she can then actually eject the sperm back out. She's like, no, thank you, not having this. Also, if you look at the diagram on the bottom there are also things called blind pouches. So essentially, even on her spiraled vagina, there are essentially like fake outs for the male's penis. Be like, nope, not the actual thing. Sorry, buddy. Your genetic material will not be being passed on today. And so it does matter. She does get to choose who she mates with, regardless of what the male's attempts might be. And so, if it is the male she's mating with that she wants to mate with, she relaxes all of her muscles, which reduces the spiral and allows the elongated penis to reach all the way through. So, that's right. It is, and it is still remaining one of the longest battle of the sexes. Evolution is kind of nonstop on that one. Something else you might not have known about ducks and male ducks is that this is a cross-dressing male duck. All right, now I'm actually just teasing you a little bit. I just couldn't help it. But this is a male duck. It looks like a female duck. Normally, if I go back to our mallard here, you've got that classic green head, right? So what happened? How can this be a male duck if it doesn't have any of those classic giveaways that happened before? And that's because of something called eclipse plumage, which I feel like most people don't realize in the duck world. So after mating happens, after he's done being all showy and broy, he actually loses his feathers to look like a hen and to be more camouflage for about a month while his feathers molt flightless during this time also. So if you ever notice in your local pond that there's this sort of moment in summer where you're like, wait, where did all the males go? They're still there. They have just swapped out their feathers, and then they'll get their fall plumage back again where they get to look all colorful and pompous. But it takes a little bit of time. So our big focus on mallards here. The first part was that my hope was you would never look at ducks again the same way. But I'm being a bit of a teaser here. There is the funny jokes about the sexual arms race. But I also want to talk about how ducks are so intrinsically tied to humans and human civilizations, and not just from a funny Disney, Daffy Duck and Looney Tunes, Donald Duck, or I guess other way around, not just from our cartoon perspective that we were showing before. So I want to hone back in on the distribution of mallard ducks across North America. And when I was doing some digging, I found some old journal entries that are stored in the Smithsonian Institute. And it's from colonial writings in the US along the East Coast, sort of between Maine and Florida. And they're talking about how during the 17th century, mallards were strictly a winter migrant. So they didn't actually breed in the Atlantic coast. So you see all that orange hanging out here on the states on the East Coast. That wouldn't have been a thing back then. So this is another important thing to think about when we think about species distribution, is it's not static in time or space, right? That's actually changing a lot. And so the cool thing about looking at these old writings is they're talking about how, one, mallards used to be strictly winter migrating. So they come up and down. They didn't breed there. And the second part was that there was a lot of them. And then because of colonization and people settling on the East Coast, they hunted them down from maybe 50 to even 80% of the population. So a huge amount were hunted and lost because people needed, You've got your settlers and your pioneers rolling in. You've got your indigenous folks living around the edge. And so the competition for food is getting really intense. And so a lot of species get really wiped out along the eastern seaboard, which is not surprising to lots of folks. But what you maybe didn't know was that in response to that, they started breeding game birds. So they started catching wild mallards, breeding them, and re-releasing them. And so this has actually, it's still going on. Um, and it's thought that in the 1940s, they were releasing nearly 2 million of these farmed birds back into the wild. And one thing that shouldn't be surprising to lots of folks is that those farmed birds don't behave the same way as wild birds. So the example of the story that comes from there is from Chesapeake Bay over along the coast there. And that's where they're talking about how these farm birds were essentially, there was 2 million birds that were farmed and then re-released in order for this to happen. And you're like, so when we think about this from a biological perspective, it means that we are essentially pumping more birds into the population, and we're changing the demographic and the dynamics, but we're also being the pressure on it. And this isn't new. So the earliest sort of case of this that we can go back in time with, if we can go back to 1631, buddy King Charles II here, big fan of duck hunting, and he wanted propagated for mallard hunting, and so he asked for the eggs to be brought in from the wild to be incubated and then re-released, right? So the King's Park and the King's Hunt and things like that. And so people have been doing this for hundreds of years. Basically, for 400 years, we've been supplementing wild populations. And today, the ballpark is that we supplement about 5 million in Europe in order for there still to be a duck hunt there. And that today, on average, it's North America, it's around 300,000. So it's actually less than what it used to be back in the day. So why do I bring this up? Well, I think it's something that we don't realize is happening, such to the point that there's lots of scientists who are making comments on how we are, to most people's general knowledge, changing wildlife in a way that we're not aware of. So this study, they called it the silent domestication of wildlife in the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a fancy way of saying kind of since humans have really started changing the world. Some scientists like the word, some scientists think it's not real, but we don't have to worry about that. Just for the sake of this, basically, the last little while that humans have really changed things dramatically, that's what we're talking about. So the last kind of few hundred years, or give or take a bit. And so they're talking about how ducks are very intrinsically, the mallard duck specifically, is very much tied to human evolution and progression, and how also we're changing what it means to be wildlife and how quote unquote wildlife exists in the world. Even the term wildlife, actually, I would say can be quite a controversial term depending on who you are and how you take it. So this is from that study. They just kind of did a summary of the mallard's relationship with people. And I just sort of want to walk through this timeline because it kind of blew my mind the first time I read it, and puts into context our relationship with the duck, and I almost like want to say responsibility to the future of the duck. So let's roll the clock way back there, and that have emblems coming up a teeny bit, but pretty much from 100,000 to 80,000 years before present, we are finding remnants of mallard ducks in Neanderthal sites, which means that there's some amount of consumption suggested. The first recorded consumption, we can go back about 11,000 years. We've got in Sweden. So good job, Scandinavians. Seems like you've got the ducks first. But here's one thing I want to point out that I think is super cool, is that the domestication of the mallard duck occurs twice, about 2,000, 2,500 years ago, with the Romans, and also in Asia, probably by the Malaysians. And so we're getting the domestication of a species right there. So that's going to change a lot of interactions. It's going to change social connotation. It's going to change, and it's changing with our society, right? Think about also what's happening and then as civilizations are progressing. Then when we're talking about King Charles there, 1631, he catches his first little birds, yay, hunting times. That's also though in the 1600s where we start building duck decoys. Duck hunting is a huge sport these days, and less for sustenance than it used to be, but there's a whole subculture that exists out there, and also a large amount of conservation done for ducks and also for duck hunting, which seems controversial, but so many wetlands, which are such a key part of a lot of ecosystems, these huge biodiversity hubs, are sustained because of duck hunters. So before you get your feathers in a ruff, pun intended, about what duck hunting is or how good or bad it is or isn't, a lot of conservation in the world is because of said duck hunters. So everyone can wear lots of hats. Just remember that. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit. We get closer in time now. We get to the 1800s where we're getting mallard ducks introduced to places they've never been before. They get brought into New Zealand and Australia. And then in those years I was talking about the 2 million ducks being farmed in the east coast of US. That's kind of that 1950s or between 1850 and 1950 period. People are hunting ducks like crazy. We're diminishing the population. They get introduced to more species as we kind of move the timeline along. And I'm going to kind of jump us to 2010 here, which is that one, mallard ducks have been added as an invasive species, and two, the wild mallard population has stopped increasing but has started declining. And those two things, when we think about them, almost seem a bit paradoxical. So if you've got an invasive species, we tend to think of things as like really expanding, but you're telling me that my wild population is going down? How in the world can that be? Well, genetically, we've introduced all of these farmed behaving ducks into a wild population, which means that we're first starting to change the way that ducks function in their natural habitat. What does that look like in sort of layman's words? Well, in the last 50 years, a lot of populations have gone from long distance migrators to short distance migrators or completely sedentary populations. Another thing that's coming in is that they are highly adapted to parks. They are one of the birds that are really, really thriving in what is essentially artificially created habitat or reconstructed wetlands. Anywhere where humans are like, oh, I would like this to look pretty. I would like this to look a certain way. Ducks are like, oh yes, thank you. We would also like it to look that way, and we would also like to eat those things. And so as humans have, I'm going to use the word maybe unkindly, manicured a lot of landscapes, the ducks have come in and occupied those landscapes. And so it's this really interesting notion now that we're left sitting with, which is what that paper was sort of trying to get at, was that what is a wild mallard duck, and do we really have any anymore? The next level of question, which is not for me to answer, but is that a good or bad thing, right? In some ways, it's great that this species has found a niche occupation. But there's lots of stories of going back. It didn't used to have so much dispersal. It used to be tied to these other key points. It's also mixing and interbreeding with other duck species that it never used to encounter before. The American black duck used to be in the east, mallard used to be in the west. They look very similar, makes sense that they can hybridize, but now the lines between the two are starting to blur to the point that people are like, ooh, are these two species anymore? And again, it's good or bad is such a tricky thing when we're talking about biology and what it really means, because that has to do with your own societal norms and morals, right? Same as what do we call a weed? What do we not call a weed? But I want to sort of follow this thought to the next step when we think about these artificial environments, aka parks, which is that this is where most people, regardless of where you are from, this is probably where you've interacted with the duck, right? Other people might have had awesome times going on hikes. Maybe you're in a subalpine and you get to see a mallard duck there. How cool is that? But the reality is this is the interaction zone where we spend the most time with them. And so again, I'm a big advocate not of what you should or shouldn't do, but if you're going to do something, try to do it well. And that brings us to the whole conversations of, do we feed ducks and what do we feed ducks? Well, we've created all of these different environments that they are now capable of existing in. And in the past, we have also created in these parks food systems for them, right? So the pond may have only been able to naturally sustain 60 ducks, but because we've been feeding them for so long, the pond now has 100 ducks. So are we now liable for sustaining the lives of the other 40 ducks, or do we stop feeding them and do we let the other 40 ducks either perish or move on, right? It depends on how you feel about nature and where and how we fit into it. But first thing we're going to tackle is, do we feed ducks bread? The age-old question that I feel like swept the world in 2019 because of viral posts and media. Okay, let's go through this. One thing I love about is a good conspiracy theory. which is that some people say that Ban the Bread, which was a campaign a few years ago, only came out because it was funded by companies selling bird food. And bird food is very, very expensive, right? It's one of those things where you're like, ooh, do I want to eat this week or do I want to feed the birds? Um, and so there's a conspiracy theory that birds can 100% eat bread. There's nothing wrong with it. We've been feeding birds bread for hundreds of years and it's fine. And we have to keep feeding them because if we tell everyone not to feed them, then those extra 40 ducks that we've been keeping alive in this pond are going to perish. People get on some serious moral high ground with this stuff, which, as you can tell, I find kind of hilarious. But there's some validity in all of these arguments. So let's like slow it down. Let's drop the conspiracy theory tone for a second, and let's walk through if we're going to feed a duck, what should we feed a duck? Well, I'm gonna start with this. Bread is not evil. I wouldn't say that it's good for them. I can see that my things didn't show up through there, but that's okay. I clicked on the wrong ones. There we go. Is that last one gonna show? Okay, sorry. I put my animations in the wrong order, so you have to forgive me. So let's talk about bread for a minute here. People have been feeding bread to ducks for hundreds of years. I was about to say millions. And you're right. For hundreds of years, most of those birds were pretty fine with it. Um, and so I'm going to point out a few things here, which is that a slice of bread is not terrible for a duck, but that is not the same as a duck entirely surviving on bread, right? Too much of anything is a poison. And I think that's really where the argument gets really sort of picky about. We also have to think about what the world has changed in the last 100 years, or, really, right? What does bread look like? What is bread made out of? I would argue that today's average white loaf of bread is like eating an ice cream cone. There's nothing really in it but sugar and carbs. And that's kind of the line that people are talking about. And so, um, do I think that you should feed bread to ducks? Not really. Do I think it is the end of the world if you do it? Also no. But here's the thing. This is the tragedy of the commons, and this is why I'm not saying that it's the end of the world, but I'm saying that if you can afford to not feed them bread, please don't. The reason is because every kind soul cannot help, oh, I've got a little something in my pocket, and they want to feed the ducks, right? Well, those birds are going to take the easiest, fastest meal, which is the bread that you've thrown on top, right? So there is still some nutrients for them, eating aquatic vegetation, getting some of those inverts at the bottom. But the reality is that we can't control, the only behavior we can control is our own. We cannot control the other 300 people that visit that pond every day and throw in one slice of bread. And so really those 300 slices of bread are poisoning a lot of ducks, right? But there are other things that I'm just going to point out now that really shouldn't be fed to ducks. You should not feed them citrus. That is not good for them. Do not feed them avocados. Avocados are poisonous to birds. Do not feed them onions. Also bad when you're thinking about food scraps and throwing things out. Again, if you're someone who has domestic ducks and some of these things get mixed in, or you're doing your compost, I'm not saying that these are like, the end all be all, but it's the same as like, you don't feed chocolate to a dog. This is not going to help them in any way, right? Some of them are certainly worse than others. Don't feed them spinach. Spinach can really affect the thickness of their eggshells. Things that are good to feed ducks, right? So things that are closer to and more reasonable to what they're eating. Ducks are kind of like vegetarian omnivores. They're mostly eating plants and little bugs and, the odd other thing that they can get. So that's things that you have at home that are fairly cheap. Some dry instant oatmeal, some cracked up corn, some frozen peas, some lettuce, some kale. If you really want to, you can go buy some pellets. Some seeds, you can get them from the bulk bin if you want, just some sunflower seeds. You don't have to go get the fancy smancy. Bird seed from the store, which you can. I think that's great. My approach to this, and I'm going to say this in the same way of, I guess, like the way I've changed my shopping behavior from my early 20s to now, is that in my early 20s, I bought the cheapest thing all the time because that's what I was afford and that was the income bracket I was surviving in. Now I have a little bit more of a buffer around that. And so I try and, buy the better quality things that I know were made in a more sustainable way. So the same thing kind of goes for this. If you're a person who can afford to buy some nice, good bird seed for them, I think that's great. I think that's awesome. If you're a person who can't, try and get them some dried oatmeal. That's cool too. And if you do make some homemade bread and throw some bread out there, I think that's really lovely. But in the same way that I don't want to feed my 13-year-old niece Wonder Bread for a week, I don't think we should be feeding any of these birds Wonder Bread strictly for a week. So that's my hope and my wish for the quality of life for all the ducks out there. And I'm going to keep us rolling because I might have spent too much time chattering about what we should and shouldn't feed to ducks, but I think it was worthwhile. Um, what I want to wrap up about the mallard duck, because we still need to talk about lots of other ducks. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about them. I haven't forgotten about teaching everyone how to become a birder, uh, and going on that journey with me as I learn how to be a better birder as well. Um, but the reason why I want to do this is I want to take something that was really familiar and I wanted to show you how we can look at a species we think, for lots of us, we know pretty well, and all of these different ways and perspectives, right? There's the historical perspective of game birds being introduced in wild populations. There is the intrinsic life of a female duck and how complicated that really is. And there is how we interact with them in these very humanized spaces, right? And how are we going to be accountable to that behavior? So I want you, hopefully, to take some of that backstory now that we've built it up around the mallard duck and carry it into the wonderful world of IDing the other ducks that we're going to see, hopefully, out in the wild. Um, and as I say that, I already almost got to apologize. I'm going to go on one more rant before we go into bird identification. So this is my parental warning label about birding language. Parental discretion is advised, or you are your own parents in this case. But this is what I want to talk about when it comes down to identifying male and female ducks. If I read one more birder's description of a female bird and they call her dull and drab and boring, I I'm gonna give up. I'm gonna stop birding. This is one of the things that I get caught on. It's the reason why it took me so long to like really dive into birds. Um, is that language is such a thing. It is so important what we call things. And because females prioritize being camouflage, and by the way, they are excellent, amazing at camouflage. They are such good survivalists. They deserve our mad respect. They do not deserve to be called dull, boring creatures because of their plumery. Perspective is a really, really huge thing. And so I am actually going to talk about exclusively male birds for the rest of this time, but I'm going to talk about it intentionally, partially because when you're learning, it is easier to find the sort of the pompously feathered, ostentatious males than it is to find the more subtle, the more aptly camouflaged females. And so, um, yeah, this is a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to go down it because I think it's worthwhile. I was at a conference about a month ago, and there was an engineer talking about how this plant was just nuisance cover. All these ranchers didn't like it because it was taking up food that could have been used for space for cows to eat, right? It was taking up grass. And so they killed all the trees, and they were bad trees. And then, lo and behold, 60 years later, it was those trees that were keeping the moisture in the desert. And now, where there's no trees, there's no water left. But if you spent your whole life, if you grow up there and you never know any word for that tree other than for it being a bad tree, you're going to think it's bad. And so our culture, when it comes to birds, a lot of the language you'll find in birding around female birds is very much, it's drab, it's dull. It is in English things that have negative connotations. Versus when for word it's for male birds, it's handsome, it's dandy, it's eloquent, it's peacock. Oh my gosh, so beautiful. Um, and that actually does have an effect on how we interpret them. The females are often deprioritized because of the language we're using around it. Wouldn't it be cool? I'm hoping, for those who are new birders today or those who are old birders turning in, wouldn't it be cool if we could flip birding language on its head? What if we could start to praise females for how amazingly camouflaged they are, how impressive it is that they raise 9 to 13 chicks running solo? What if we change the language rather than being like, oh, it's the male bird so I'm going to be a bit cheeky for the rest of this, and I'm going to throw some shade on the over the top males for the rest of this time. But I am going to talk about males, and hopefully in a later time we'll have a bigger chat about females. And again, for those who maybe weren't here for part one, this is just a reminder. This is not about teaching you. It's the old pun. I'm not going to give you a fish. I'm going to teach you how to fish. I'm not here to give you the birds. Memorization is awful. I think it's not the way to do things. I think we incorporate things through story and we train ourselves to look for things. So I'm not going to give you the birds. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the tools for how to look for them and how to find them yourselves. All right, we're jumping in the world of ducks. We're doing it. The first thing, you don't even have to know the names of ducks. The first thing you're going to learn to start identifying is, do I see a diver or do I see a dabbler? And what does that mean? Well, it's referring to how that duck makes its way in the world. How does it make its living? Dabblers are the ones that don't really go deep. They're the funny ones on cartoons where they just kind of flip their bum up, put their beak down at the bottom, grab something, and pop back up. They don't dive very deep. Those ones are eating mostly aquatic vegetation, eating some inverts, any little bits along the bottom they can get to. You generally find them in shallower water. Versus our divers, which, as you may guess by the name, they like to go deeper. They're going to eat deeper aquatic vegetation, but those are also going to be our fishers. They're going to go after, they can also go after like mollusk type things on the bottom, shellfish, things like that, fish, but they're going deep down, and their bodies are made to reflect that. So again, a cool thing whenever you look at a bird, if you're looking at a duck, we talked about this again in part 1, center of gravity. These are animals that can fly. Their center of gravity is so important, and it reflects how they make their livelihood. So on the, let's do the right side first. So the gadwall is a dabbler. That means that its feet are further forward and it walks better on land, but the trade-off for divers, on contrast, their feet are further back. So what that means is that they're more awkward on land. They're kind of funnier to watch. They got more of that big waddle, but they have way more powerful legs for swimming, which makes sense because they need to get their good flutter kicks going down so that they can catch up to those speedy little fishes. And there's 2 other differences, but I'm going to bring those up in a minute. So this is a picture. We're just going to focus on dabblers first. We're going to focus on the ones that go bloop bloop, tail up, pop back up, right? They like to dabble. That's their call. And this is about 11 of the most common species that you'll find in North America. And this might seem super overwhelming because look at all the colors, look at the different beaks, look at the tails. How am I going to remember all of these? Well, the coolest thing, or the best way to just take a deep breath and to let it all go, is we're going to play a very famous game in the birding world, and it's called Where's the White? The best way to learn birding is to forget about color. And you can hold on to shape too, but I would say even you can kind of let go of shape for a little bit. And size, all of those things are going to be a big distraction. One of the simplest things to start with is just start thinking in black and white. Birding is a very inclusive hobby this way. And just think about, where's the white on these birds? This is starting with very basic pattern recognition that can actually get you through the majority of species without knowing very little else about them, which is kind of amazing. Most other things you have to key through 17 features. But if we just focus on where's the white on their body and the consistency of those patterns, we can make our way through a lot of birds. So we're going to take one as an example. We're going to start with the northern shoveler. Let's talk about some of the things we're seeing on this bird, right? So we've got the fun color picture, but let's just ignore that for a second and let's just look at the black and white picture. So it's got a dark head, it's got quite a wide, kind of elongated beak. That's where it gets its, the shovel beak from. It's a nice giveaway for this bird. But what happens if it's hard to see the beak, right? You can look at that big white chest coming out. That's kind of a nice giveaway. It's got some white on the back, and then kind of like the black and white's a bit spotty along the back, right? So we're kind of getting a sense of what it looks like, getting a bit of a shape of if we were to try and find a shoveler. And when we're out there, there's some cool traits we can kind of think about the shoveler's life so we can help remember it, where it fits in. So the shoveler has 110 lamellae. And what those are, you see those little lines in the beak there? That's for the filter feeding. It goes down and it filters through all the little crustacean-y bits, the seeds, the aquatic little animals. So think about a shoveler, and lots of ducks have these. They're just really pronounced on the shoveler. Think about that like a baleen whale. They're filtering through all of those yummy bits on the bottom, all those little things. So that's one of the things we're going to use to help remember which bird is the shoveler. Another cool thing about them is that they'll tend to work in groups when they're feeding, and they can kind of rotate like a pinwheel and stir up a bunch of food, and then the other birds can come and dabble it up. So pretty cool. Okay, so now let's think about identifying a shoveler. Well, first, let's just talk about what these 2 birds have in common. If you were to see 2 of these in a pond, and it might seem really obvious right now, but remember, these are far away. You got the sunlight laying on them. Maybe they're flying away from you. It can be really hard to tell the difference. So when we look at these 2 birds, if we think about similarities first, they both have got a green head. They both have kind of got some black and some white. And and then kind of roughly the same shape. We don't really know size-wise which one is bigger, so that's not super helpful to us right now. But let's go about things that are, um, uh, whoops, what do I want to say here? So now things that are different. So we've got the white line on the mallard, right? So the shoveler doesn't have that collar, and it's kind of got their tails are a little bit different. If you notice that the shoveler, they're kind of shooting off into space, whereas the mallard has some curly tails there. And so sitting here right now, you might be like, yeah, I can 100% tell the difference between these two ducks. What about now? Aha. Things get much different when you have lots of them, when they're moving, when they're not being nice and sitting still for your camera. You're like, come on, duck, you can do better than that. So just go back to black and white, right? Because when we're looking at all of these ducks from far away, really we're just seeing some basic patterns on them. So black and white, if we look at the mallard first, again, that white ring we notice around the neck, but also that white jutting tail that comes out. And then the rest of it's actually kind of like a grayish. We're going to call it that because we're looking in black and white right now. Then if we look at the shoveler, distinctive white breast, also a pretty chunky white patch on the back, right? So that changes how we can think about things. So if we look at them in flight, we should be able to, I'll give you a second. Hopefully you can guess who is who here, on which side is which, right? We've got the shoveler on the right side. We've got that big white breast. We've got the mallard with the darker breast. You can see the ring around its neck. You're like, not very hard to guess, right? Like, oh, Kristina, this is not so hard. We can do this. All right, I'm gonna up the level here a little bit. What about now? How do you know which bird is which, right? Things get much trickier depending on which part of the bird you can see. And especially with dabbling ducks, we actually do see their butts quite a bit. So this is a very valid skill for you to start building up about being able to tell which duck butt is which duck butt. So can you tell which one is which? Okay, let's go back to the black and white and let's think about what we can think about the game. Where's the white? So if we look at the mallard, we've got that white stripe on its butt, kind of a thinner line, versus if we look at the northern shoveler, it's more of a bigger blotch or a patch, right? So then if we go and look at their bums again, we can see again that stripe that we saw from a cross-section view is actually forming a V on our mallard on the left. And you can see that that bigger white patch extends all the way around on the shoveler on the right. So this is no jokes. This is the way that a lot of birders, it's a key way of starting off, right? This is some very basic information where before, imagine 5 minutes ago, you did not know how to tell the difference between these two duck butts. And now you are becoming an excellent, excellent birder. I'm so proud. We're coming so far. All the things that we're learning. Okay, let's stick with the shoveler and let's keep going and seeing what other birds we can start to distinguish it from, just using where's the white. So these are three other birds that share a common trait with the northern shoveler. They all have green on their head. The top one is called a green-winged teal, got the northern shoveler in the middle, and an American widgeon on the bottom. And we can find them overlapping in lots of different habitats across North America. So again, when you first look at the patterns, you're like, yeah, I can tell the difference between all these three. The widgeon's kind of got a black back, and the shoveler's sort of got a checkered back, and then the green one, it's got like brown on the back. Like these are all pretty, right? But the reality is that when you're out there looking at a lot of birds, or when they're far away and they're not being kind and holding still for you, you just need the basics. So just look at the right side. What are the key features of where's the white? Our green teal is wearing a nice white sash on its collar. Who knows, maybe it won a medal. Our green shoveler has its nice big broad white. It's got a little white square on the back. And our widgeon has a white crown, and it's got a little white blot. And it does have that little white slit on the side too, which can be hard to see. So don't always bank on finding that one, but it's always one to look for. If you see it, that's a nice giveaway. So just stick with our game. Where's the white? So when we think about our green-winged teal, and we can also start, as you start to spend more time out there, and I really hope that you do, because birds are so much fun, so much envy for animals that can fly away to warmer, hotter places, hey? Teals, when we incorporate some behavior into that, is that They tend to fly in larger flocks, and they're quite small, relatively speaking, and they can get to some pretty high speeds. They can actually fly almost 50 miles an hour, which is incredible when you think about it. Um, and the thing I want to point out here is that the white sash that they're so proud to wear when they're swimming in the water, so in that top right there, you can't see that when it's flying. And so this is one of those things where you kind of have to get used to birds showing you different features. When they're flying, when they're dabbling, when they're just chilling, when they're on land, you're going to see different parts of them. And I know that makes the game kind of harder and more intimidating. But again, just start with what you know. You know, if you start with knowing from them swimming, then when they eventually take off and you look at them flying, you're going to build up some of your own pattern recognition and your own knowledge. So when we think about comparing a northern shoveler to a green winged teal flying, um, again, just that nice big white chest, we can just knock it off the list. Our green teal doesn't have that, so we know it's not going to be the northern shoveler. And if we go look at the widgeon, we're looking for a white head or we're looking for that little white line. Well, if we compare these two flying, that white head is harder to see from the cross section, but you can see white shows up on their wing, and you can also see that bigger white underneath their belly actually wraps around, right? So it's kind of like it's like playing Clue. For anyone who likes a good investigation, you're building up some of those same skills. And before we leave the widgeon alone, just some fun things about it. The widgeon has the most goose-like beak. It's very short, and that ties into the fact because it eats the most amount of aquatic plants. So not that any of them are truly vegetarians, but if you want help remembering the widgeon is the closest one to being a vegetarian. And rolling with the green head. Okay, so we're almost done with the dabblers, and we're almost near end of time, so I'm going to try and squeeze this in as best I can. Right, stick with just basic. Where's the white? It's going to help you narrow things down, especially when you've got lots of flocks of birds. When you're just learning, you can let go of so many details. That's kind of the beautiful things about ducks. These are big, gregarious birds with lots of personality, and they don't ask a lot of you to figure out who they are. And I'm going to switch over from dabblers here to divers. But the thing I wanted, the other key distinguishing feature, even if all you come away from this webinar is, wow, I can tell the difference between a dabbling duck and a diving duck, you are 100% winning. You are doing so good. And this is a fun way to tell the difference between a dabbling duck and a diving duck. I know I was talking about center of gravity and where their feet are, and you're like, I don't really get that. I couldn't tell which one was taking off or which one was which. Well, here's how that plays out in the way that they move. A dabbling duck, when it goes to take flight, can do a little jump and then flap, and it can get itself going quite quickly. For simplicity, we'll just say it's a little more aerodynamic energy-wise, so it can jump up and then start to flap away. That's what this beautiful blue-winged teal here is doing. And the blue-winged teal, the way that we can remember that one is that it does have green on its wing, like the green wingtail. Rude, hard to tell apart. But the blue-winged teal has that big, beautiful face band. So it's got the mark on its face, whereas the green-winged teal likes to wear a white sash. Just stick with the white. It won't steer you wrong. It's the best way to do it. Now, in contrast, we're finally going to talk about a diving duck. Diving ducks need to take a run at it. They do not have the ability to get enough lift in order to just jump and take off on their own. So when you see a bird that has to really like this bufflehead is going, you automatically know, hey, that's a diving duck. It's digging, it's going down deep. It relies on fish. It has a different life cycle, livelihood. What am I trying to say? Livelihood. So while we're on the bufflehead, I chose it because it's kind of one of my favorites, mostly because I enjoy saying bufflehead. Also because they're pretty cool, pretty beautiful birds. Again, you can see how far the feet are back. See how they're in line with the tail? That's another distinctive thing about diving ducks, those feet being further back. They're one of the more rare or fewer ducks here, diving ducks that we have in North America. One of my favorite things about them is that their courtship involves them doing a water ski. That's part of how they impress the female, which I think is hilarious. And in order for them to migrate, they have to carry a quarter of their body weight in fat. So that's how long their migration is and how small they are. They just got to put on the pounds and then they take off and away they go. So we're talking about how they take off. That's one way you can identify a diving duck. But I think a very fun way here's one of the most typical things about diving ducks that won't steer you wrong, which is that diving ducks are very monochromatic. They're very white and black, and they also sit really low in the water. So if at any point you're looking out on a pond and you're like, oh, that bird kind of reminds me of a zebra, then yes, you are in fact looking at one of the many diving ducks. So we're going to split them into diving ducks and sea diving ducks here. And I know I'm almost at time. I promise I'm almost there. All right. So as far as this, hopefully there's time to when we roll through these on a more specific level. But this is one again. Just think about the world in black and white. Look, notice how there's way more bigger white patches on most of our diving ducks. We've got larger patches of black. And if we do look at them in color, there's a few browns, you got a blue bill here or there, but they're very much monochromatic. And so that black and white patterning is what you're going to use to distinguish between them. And then also because they're mostly black and white, you can start to think about their shape a little bit more, right? So just to use two as an example really quick here, if we go in the bottom right corner, the common goldeneye versus the Barrow's goldeneye, just take away the color because they're black and white anyways. So our Barrow's goldeneye has a rounder head. Also, if we look at the little white patches on its flank there, on its wing, they make more of like a full-on checkerboard. Whereas if you look at the white patches on a goldeneye, it's these wispy long lines of white. And it's also got that more bulky head. If you look at the face patch, you've got a white circle for the goldeneye, whereas the Barrow's goldeneye has got a big kind of tear going down. And I know these seem like a lot, when you're trying to look at them all one by one, but really you just start off with, is this or is this that? No, is this or is this that? Just do it kind of two birds at a time. And you're going to be able to become a way better birder than you ever thought you could be before. Our sea ducks, finally closing up in here. These are our largest ducks. The common eider is actually our biggest duck here in North America, and you can see their niche. What they do in the ecosystem is reflected in their size. So these are bigger fishers. They've got bigger beaks for going down. Some of them are even eating mussels along the bottom, and they can dive a long ways. The deepest diver here is our friend the long-tailed duck, very suave-looking bougie duck in my opinion. And they can dive almost 200 feet, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. The air gets compressed out of their feathers, and so when they go down and then they pop back up, then their hairdo has to reset, which might be secretly my favorite thing. All right, recognizing we are at the time, I'm going to do a shameless shout out to Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I do this shamelessly because I think they're doing such awesome, great work, and they're so good about sharing so many things freely. The whole basis of Where's the White, they've developed a lot of it. They have a lot of it already prepped and ready. You can get one of these pamphlets for less than $10 and essentially cut yourself loose on the duck world, and you will start getting your 30 North American species in no amount of time. So with that, recognizing we're at the end, I will pass it back to you, Rob.
All right, Kristina, thank you so much. Now, before we start in with some questions, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some of these questions. So, how does a duck protect their young ones from predators?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, So males don't participate in brood rearing, so that means that they're not there as a defense mechanism in most duck species. And the females, it's largely camouflage. It's largely running away. Some of them will get a bit more aggressive in turn, but the reality is if you've got 9 little ones to chase after, the goal is to get away. So as far as fight or flight, their usual response is flight.
Great, thank you. So one of our guests once saw 4 ducklings swimming together and then saw 2 adult females swim over them and drown them. Do you know why something like that would happen?
I don't. That's an intense thing to see. Off the top of my head, my guess would be that those are not their chicks, and so ducks are really territorial. Again, I don't have a solid answer, but this is my assumption. Ducks are super duper territorial with other ducks, and so if a female might have come and dropped them off, that's one possibility. The other possibility that just popped into my head, depending on the time of year, is that those might have been eclipse males, but there's no reason for them to be aggressive. Um, yeah, I don't have a solid answer for you. I apologize, but yeah, it'll my best guess is territory.
Great. Thank you so much. Um, so, um, uh, let's see. So, how is climate change affecting the mating and migration patterns?
Yeah, that one is such a tricky one. I'm just going to talk about it in really broad strokes. So one of the things that's happening with migration patterns and timing is that migration is usually triggered by daylight. The amount of daylight is cues a species in the south when it's time to come north again for the summer. Now, what's happening is that all these species have evolved that timing situation that, we know we need to leave on this day of daylight because by the time we show up here at Alaska, let's say, that will give us the most amount of food. But what's happening is that because our climate is changing so rapidly, when those birds are arriving, the peak food might have already come and gone. So it's already warmed up earlier, and so they're coming at a lower time in food abundance, which then has a trickle down effect on chick survival, things like that. So that's one kind of broad stroke issue with climate change and migration. There, I will also say that on a micro level, there are lots of like pluses and minuses. It's not this full stroke sweep everywhere is getting awful very quickly. But the reality is that we've kind of broken the clock. We've broken the timing. And so there are going to be a lot of ricochet effects of that for different species in different ways. And I would also say that anyone that tells you that they got all the answers to that, like, beware. But I think that's the biggest thing, is just being accountable for the fact that we're making those changes, and that can show up in different ways in different ecosystems.
Great. Thank you so much. So, can you explain to us again or clarify how the female duck can change its sex?
Oh, sorry. That I was just making a joke. I was full on making a joke. The female duck cannot change its sex.
Ah,
What that was, I was just trying to be funny. So the male duck for about depending on the species, maybe a month or so, the male duck loses all of those really ostentatious feathers and looks like a female for a period of time every year. And pretty much all ducks do this. It's called the eclipse plumage because the idea being that they used to be big and bright and then they go dark and shady and then they come back to their bright colors again. So I made the joke that we have cross-dressing ducks that no one knows about um, during that time.
got it. Thank you for clarifying that one. Um, are loons ducks?
Loons are not ducks. They are the not duck, but they are in that same broader family. Um, as you can tell, I already had a hard enough time fitting in the ducks that we talked about today. So there may yet be a not duck webinar in the future. But yeah, we're going to keep going with the birding ones for those who are hanging in here. The next birding webinar is going to be about Merlin, the birding app, and how you can get the most out of it and how you can use it to identify. We'll pick a different group of ducks. We might do we'll pick a different group of birds. We'll probably do songbirds or something like that via Merlin. So stay tuned for that one in a couple weeks.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Thank you, everyone. I was really stoked to get to dive into the world of ducks with you, to dabble in the world of ducks with you. And this is the final send off message. I hope that you hang out. I'm going to keep doing lots of birding webinars for at least before polar bear season up until now, until October, because I'm so excited to grow a new skill with everyone and to make birding a little bit more silly and a little bit more fun and a little bit less intimidating than I know it can feel sometimes. So my final send off today is always be yourself when birding, unless you can be a duck. Then always be a duck. And I'll pass it back to you, Rob.
Christina, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. If you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on the website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.